Please stand by while I get the live stream set up.
There we are. Huh.
Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Was it cold enough for you?
It is in the low 70s where I am.
Oh.
I couldn't take the cold weather.
I thought.
Personally, I think it's welcome to have a little bit of change of temperature.
I do too.
It's a welcome respite from the summer heat.
Oh, yes.
Right.
All right.
We'll just give it another minute to let people continue to log in through YouTube or the Zoom.
I'm trying to see if it's on Zoom. Oh, there we are. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. For the benefit of those who have arrived on time, want to continue to encourage that wonderful behavior. So we are picking up in Vayishlach, the next Torah portion, of course, but we're going to be picking up in chapter 35. That means I need to just do a quick reminder of what's happened before this. When last we met our patriarch Jacob, he and his family had fled from Laban's house. They eventually came to an agreement with Laban, and now they are heading back into the land of Canaan and the land of Canaan, Jacob's hometown, if you will. And we see at the beginning of this week's Torah portion the arrival of Esau with a lot of armed men. And there's a great deal of tension that perhaps there's going to be a slaughter of Jacob and his family. It doesn't happen. Sorry for the spoiler. After that, we then see them move into the area around Shechem, where another tragedy takes place. This time, the rape of Jacob's daughter, Dinah. Our chapter 35, is picking up after that point. So after Dinah had been attacked, her brothers came up with a plan to basically trick the people of the town of Shechem into circumcising themselves and thus become medically weakened during their recovery, so that they could then enter the town, slaughter the people, and retake their sister from having been abducted into this very unfortunate circumstance. There was a lot of concern by Jacob about perhaps there becoming a pushback from the people of the land over this massacre, and that is sort of where we leave off in the previous chapter. Everyone got that?
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the parts that most people focus on, because those are the most exciting parts of the Torah portion. Often the case, I like to look at some of the boring things, because if it got into the Torah, it made the cut. That means that there is something of value there, and not only for our ancestors, but for all of us in every generation. So let's explore a little bit of chapter 35 and see what we can glean from this that will justify why it is still here amongst all of these other exciting, action-packed stories with so much more drama. Chapter 35, verse 1. And God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Beit El, and remain there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." So God does a quick reminder that Jacob, when he was leaving home, all the way back at the beginning of last week's Torah portion of Vayetze, has the dream, very famous, with the ladder going to heaven and the angels going up and coming down. And when he was there, he made a promise to God. He took a vow, and God is now basically saying, you know what? It's time for that vow to be handled, for that to be taken care of. So go back to that place, go back to Beit El, and fulfill your vow there by having the altar and making an altar like you had described before. Verse 2. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Rid yourselves of the alien gods in your midst. Purify yourselves and change your clothes." Okay, purify. We're getting ready for a sacrifice. Doing a sacrifice in ritual purity is the norm and required. Changing your clothes seems a little unusual, but the one, of course, that really stands out are these Elohei HaNechar, right? Who are these foreign gods? What are we talking about here? Any hypotheses?
Well, there's Rachel, what she took with her.
Right.
But there's something else going on here too.
All right. So one option is that this is referring to Rachel in particular, and perhaps the other people that came with them from Lavan. Remember that he traded in sheep and goats and was able to build up his household more than just his immediate family. But maybe others who would come back with him, like Rachel did, brought with them some of the gods, the idols, that came from that part of the world. And so he may be now saying, get rid of these holdovers, your baggage, if you will, that comes from Lavan's household. And now we are moving on to the next stage.
Rabbi, there's something else that strikes me is this comes right after the whole episode. First, Jacob buys property in Shechem, which implies he's having a lot of interactions with the idolaters. Then the sons shed a lot of blood. And this also reminds me of the first chapter of Isaiah, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Though your sins be like scarlet, they shall be made white as snow. There's been a lot of shedding of blood. So the idea that there has to be some sort of move on, leave the property behind that he paid for, which always strikes me as, whatever happened to that land he bought. But then there is this, you've got the whole going through the idea of purification evokes repentance.
All right, so this may be a more acknowledgement that he has been focused for the last few chapters on first amassing his wealth, then on placating his brother, then on establishing himself financially and within the local community, that perhaps there are some problems, especially as that led to all the bloodshed, as you mentioned. So maybe this is meant to be a turning over of a new leaf that God is telling him to change. Indeed, there's a very famous midrash from last week's Torah portion where he has the dream about the different sheep and maximizing the output of his flocks, that God says, you used to dream of angels, now you're dreaming of goats. You've been living here too long. Time to get back to the land of Israel and get your head in the right place. And maybe indeed that's exactly what's happening here. Maybe he is trying to refocus himself, to put his head in the right place. We're going to come back to this idea in more detail through our commentary. So let's go ahead and get a little bit more about what happens with Jacob's instructions to the family. Come, let us go up to Bethel, and I will build an altar there to the God who answered me when I was in distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. Indeed, we have seen that God is not a local God, which was a common belief in the ancient world, that there were gods that were located in different geographical places. That was their turf, and you wouldn't expect the gods to help you when you left those boundaries. Our God, right, the God that's been with Jacob, has been with Jacob no matter where he's gone, no matter what the circumstances, when he was in distress and when he was blessed. So this is a very powerful statement of his connection to God. And the response of his family: they gave to Jacob all the alien gods that they had and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the terebinth that was near Shem. And then we see the result from the surrounding area. As they set out, a terror from God fell on the cities round about, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. This terror, this fear, this dread that is happening in verse 5, most commentators say this was God's act of protection that would prevent retaliation from the other local area citizens for what happened in Shem. That indeed, what had been provoked by his sons was about to lead to a massacre of his family in retaliation, but it was only through God's intervention that those plans were derailed, so that the people did not attack them. All right, any questions on what we have read so far before we just see a little bit more of the fulfillment of his promise here?
I was going to point out that we're told twice that you arise to go to Bethel, and then we're told that the idols are put below you. So there's this idea of spiritually going up. And then the final thing with verse 5, all is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. But here we see the fear of God somehow being imposed.
Right. So the idea of the fear of God, the awe of God, is different than the idea of being afraid of battle. Right. When we talk about the fear of God in in rabbinic sense, or even in other parts of the Tanakh, that when they talk about Yirei Hashem, the fear of God, it means that one is so in awe of God as to be obedient to the commandments. As to give oneself to the mitzvot. But when we talk about an army being afraid, it doesn't mean that they are suddenly pious and submissive to God's will. It means that they are literally afraid of the circumstances. And that's more what's happening here.
Okay.
And the blemish of what happened at Shechem, that attack, never leaves Levi's character. I mean, it's even in their final blessings is that they committed an act of violence. So the violence was not condoned.
Indeed.
So they needed God to protect them because...
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, these few chapters are in fact consecutively crossing off different members of the brothers as potential leaders for the people of Israel. Reuben is crossed off because of his misdeeds with his father's couch, which is couched in other terms. And then, of course, Levi and Shimon are crossed off in their behavior here as well. Judah comes very close to being crossed off, but then is reconciled through his dealings with Tamar, and then finally given the full stamp of approval as the leader of the brothers during their dealings with Joseph in Egypt. So yeah, the individual stories also make up a chain of why wasn't why weren't the first three sons the people who ended up leading the Jewish people? So yes, all of them did things that were strongly condemned, either explicitly or implicitly by the Torah. So let's get to that fulfillment scene in verse 6. Then Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel. It's a synonym in the land of Canaan. He and all the people who were with him. There he built an altar and named the site Bethel, for it was there that God had revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. And then we get just an interesting aside that I don't want to pass up. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Bethel, so it was named Alon Bachut. Right, so we didn't actually know much about Rebekah's nurse. We knew that she came with her when she left and came to marry Isaac, but here we see that she is passing away. And there's a great deal of commentary about why this was important and significant, but unfortunately I didn't really have a place to squeeze that in today. So highly recommend, go to Sefaria.com, 35 verse 8, click on it, read the commentary. It's a very interesting interesting set of explanations. All right, so we instead are going to be focusing more on these alien gods of what in the world are we doing with alien gods in the midst of our patriarchal family. This is not what we expect to find, and of course our commentary is going to find a way to give us much to learn from this, so that we know what we are dealing with. All right, where's my top of the page? There we go. And zoom in for the benefit. I don't really need the table of contents. You can go away now. There we go. All right, so we start off where we often do with the straightforward, short, and sometimes unclear, but here pretty clear, teachings of Rashi. Put away the strange gods, these alien gods, these foreign gods, which you have from the spoil of Shechem. Right? So what Rashi is saying is that where did these foreign gods come from? Not from Lavan's world, but from the treasure that they took when they attacked and murdered the people of Shechem. That when they took loot, among the loot were their idols, statues of gold and silver that were made of precious metals. It would have been quite obvious that that taking them would be a good idea, because, you know, ka-ching. And here we are being told to get rid of them. Why and how is something we're going to have to deal with with more commentary. We also find from Rashi the idea of purifying themselves. Here is not talking about the generic purification that comes before offering a sacrifice, but instead is talking about purifying themselves of idol worship. We wouldn't imagine that Jacob would be engaged in idol worship, but certainly the other members of the household either took the idols because they wanted them, or took the idols because it was just normal to have idols around, or had not yet completely divested themselves of idolatrous practice and beliefs. And so this purification, Rashi says, is of removing that from their consciousness before they move to Bethel, and therefore before they start offering a sacrifice to the real God. Questions or comments? Rashi, like I said, here is fairly straightforward in his interpretation, but he's not the only one. Not the only interpretation, of course. Chizkuni gives a different twist. He says removing the alien deities, which always sounds like something from science fiction, that this was required in order to avoid giving the impression that prayers or sacrifices were intended for them. If they were taking the loot with them, and that loot included alien gods and idols, then when they start offering sacrifices at Bethel, then it might appear that they are making the sacrifices in honor of the idols. So Chizkuni is really just a very practical idea here. make sure that no one can misunderstand what you are about to do. This has nothing to do with the idols that you just took. This has nothing to do with anything at all that's idolatrous. Junk them so there's no mistake. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Right? And sometimes that's often very hard. Sometimes when we have not necessarily idols, but symbols or memorabilia or attachments to things that could mean something to us. In this case, they could mean, like with Rachel, it might have meant something that was an attachment to her home, even if she didn't worship it, or with the spoils from Shechem, which would be seen as proper recompense for the rape of Dinah and proper spoils. That just because that's what it means to you doesn't mean that's what it means to everyone else. And sometimes, even if you have a in quote, legitimate reason to have it, sometimes you have to divest of it in order to properly prevent any misunderstanding of why are you still holding on to this? Ibn Ezra takes us a little bit more into understanding why the change of clothes was part of this, arguing that it is incumbent upon the Israelite, when he goes to pray in a fixed place, to have a clean body and clean clothes. We take this for granted in the modern world where we have closets full of clothes and running water in most of our homes. But in the ancient world, this was something that you would have to strive to accomplish. Many people had only one set of clothes, or perhaps an additional set, but that additional set would be saved for the specific times when you were going to pray. Now, this, of course, means we have to ask the question, what is it about a fixed place that requires this? Shouldn't this be incumbent for any time we pray? Any thoughts or suggestions on how to reconcile that?
Well, I would say that, for most people in the ancient medieval world, or even up to this century, you only had one fixed, you didn't have an entire wardrobe.
Right.
So you had one set of clothes that you would keep for a special day for prayer. And a fixed place meant that you weren't supposed to just be, there was times when you needed to be with others in the fixed place. Or you could pray in a fixed place, but I think the idea that you had to have a set of clothes and clean yourself at least when you prayed, it doesn't say Shabbat here, but it kind of leads to that conclusion for me.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, how often do we
Sorry.
pray? Right? How often do we pray? We would pray 3 times a day, 4 on Shabbat in the formal prayers, and perhaps more for other occasions that came up on special events. But many of those times, for many people who weren't among the elite, they didn't have the luxury of going to the synagogue for the morning prayer, for Shacharit, or for the afternoon prayer in particular, for Mincha. That meant that they would have to pray just before or just as they arrived for work, before dawn, or they would pray during their lunch break. And it would have been an impossibility to have always had a clean body and clean clothes. It would have become a barrier to prayer if that had been a full requirement. On the other hand, Ibn Ezra is reminding us that if we don't make an effort when it is possible, if we don't make an effort to clean ourselves up and to wear something nice when we have the luxury of more time, then we are also missing out on that psychological benefit of preparing ourselves for prayer, and on the communal reinforcement that comes when we add ourselves in our best form among the others in their best form, to each remind each other that we are all trying to the best of our ability during these special times of gathering. So what is being struck here is a very important balance. It's not just come as you are whenever you want because, it's whatever's good. It says try a little harder when you can, but if you can't, of course, do where you are. And that balance is one that's very important. Yes.
Rabbi, as someone who's preparing to go to mikvah, I was more focused on the purify yourself first, because we're told first, you first purify yourself, and then after you've purified, then you get the clean clothes. But it's this whole process of preparation for drawing near to God.
But Ibn Ezra is not saying only purification in the sense of mikvah. He is also saying be clean,
Both.
right?
Right.
Wash off the muck. not only go to the mikvah, which is a different level, but just in general, have a bath, have a shower, or at the very least, take a damp cloth and wipe off some of the worst bits of muck that you picked up during the week.
But it's also where they're going. Of the place of God, El Bethel, as if you're going to have an audience with the king. Do you come in your traveling clothes, or do you first stop and bathe and dress before you appear in the court of the king?
Correct. All right, so let's return to these idols now that we've gotten some of the more additional tangential topics out of the way. So, seeing that Jacob was about to leave the present location, he was afraid that perhaps some would take along trinkets which had served the people of Shechem as idols. Since Jacob's entourage did not include idol worshippers of the local population, there had not been anyone who could neutralize these gods before they had come into the tents of Jacob's camp. Once that happened, there is no way a Jew can neutralize these gods except by destroying them completely. All right. Welcome to the Halacha of dealing with idol worshippers, which for most of us is purely theoretical, but which I hope through our discussion will still yield some very useful insights for the modern world. So in classical Jewish Halacha, back in the days when there were Greeks, Romans, and every other idol worshiper running around us, the rabbis had a bit of a question. They said, wait a minute, if you come across a gold idol, just lying in the middle of the road, what do you do? Do you get to keep it and melt it down? Do you have to destroy it and cast it into the Dead Sea, which was the preferred dealing? And they came up with an option, which we're going to look at in more detail in just a second from the Gemara, from the Talmud, that you could desanctify what Or HaChaim is talking about here as neutralize, right? You could cancel out the pseudo-divinic aura that others had about the idol. But there's a problem. You, the Jew, can't do it. You cannot desanctify what an idol worshiper holds to be sacred. Only the idol worshiper can desanctify it. And in this case, says Or HaChaim, we've got a problem. All the locals are dead. Right? So who's going to desanctify it for you? You just killed them and took their stuff, and now their stuff has idols, and you can't desanctify the idol. So the only thing that is left, especially once it's entered your possession, is to destroy it. And that's what they set about doing by burying it under the tree. If you're still a little confused about the whole desanctification of other people's gods and all of that, just hold on for those questions until we finish the section from the Talmud that's coming up immediately. But if you have other questions about what Or HaChaim is talking about here, pipe up now. I know we don't normally think about the idols of others as being held to be sacred, because obviously we don't. But that was precisely the problem in Judaism, is that since others held them as sacred, when you picked it up, you were not able to change the sanctity of that item as it was seen by others. Remember, as the commentary said earlier, that if the idols were present when we moved on, even if they were just there as loot or as some memento, a souvenir, that there would be the impression that they were part of your worship service. Even if you didn't mean it, they had a sanctity attached to them by others. And no matter what you, the Jew, could do to tell others that's not how you meant it, they would still see it as being a sacred object. And that's why the Talmud goes into a great deal of detail on this particular issue. We're only going to look at a single excerpt that deals with this topic. But this section of Avodah Zarah, which is the Talmud section dealing with idol worship, goes into many more discussions. So, Rabba Bar Bar Chana said, that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said. So that means we're getting a chain of tradition. Once, it's a story. Once I was following Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, on the road, and he found a ring there, and there was a figure of a dragon on it. A dragon was a very common symbol for idolatrous worship in his area. And he then encountered a minor Gentile boy, meaning underage, but did not say anything to him. He then encountered an adult Gentile and said to him, revoke, right? Neutralize, meaning the ring's idolatrous status. But the Gentile did not revoke it, right? He's like, no, it's a ring that is sacred to so-and-so. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar then slapped him across the face, whereupon the Gentile succumbed and revoked its idolatrous status. We're going to pause there, right? He is physically coercing the guy to declaring that the ring isn't sacred anymore, which will then allow Rabbi Elazar HaKapar to take it, melt it down, and use the value of the ring as his own treasure, as his own benefit. The Gemara comments, learn from this incident 3 halachot, right? There are 3 things you can learn from this. Learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the idolatrous status of both his object and the idol worship of that of another Gentile, right? It didn't have to be the original owner of the ring who said, this is no longer sacred. It could be a guy who worshiped other things, that an idol worshiper is an idol worshiper is an idol worshiper, and any one of them are interchangeable for revoking the apparent sanctity of a thing. 2, and learn from it the fact that Rabbi Elazar HaKapar waited to find an adult Gentile, that only one who is aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessories can revoke the idol status. But one who is not aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessory, such as a minor, a child, cannot revoke the idol status. So the reason why he just walked past the idolatrous young man was because he was not old enough to legally revoke the status, because he was not old enough to truly understand what idolatry was and what its worship was built around. And finally, learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the status of an idol even against his will. All right, that last one, I'm guessing, is the one that is probably going to cause the most discussion.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, it seems like a bad precedent that we would sanction forcing people to do things unwillingly. It just, especially if physical coercion is involved.
Indeed, and the concept of what's known as ones, which is compulsion in Jewish law, is very stringent, that you cannot force people to obey or to do something, and those that are not held liable.
Right.
You
you can't force somebody to kill somebody. You can't force somebody to commit idolatry. You can't force somebody to sin.
Well, you can, and indeed many people have, but the person who performs the act is not considered to have performed a legal act. If I hold a gun to my neighbor's head and say, sign over your property to me, and then I walk away with the deed, happy that I now own their house, when they go to the cops are going to say, I'm sorry, you don't own the house now. That purchase, in quotes, is not legally binding because you used force to create that situation. And so naturally, we're uncomfortable with this in this situation.
On the other hand, you can use force to save a life.
You can use force to save a life to stop somebody from hurting another. Absolutely.
Or hurting themselves.
Or hurting themselves. However, here, that's not exactly what's happening. There's a couple of different issues that are happening here. So one of them is that we obviously want to desanctify as much idolatry as possible. Right? Idolatry is a poison, and since only the people who worship it have the antidote, then sometimes we need to force them to cough up the antidote in order that the poison of idolatry can be removed. Secondly, more practically, there's the issue that if an idolater would not desanctify it, then there's a possibility that the item would be held onto by a Jew and would still have that sacred status, and that might lead to the Jewish person transgressing the prohibition on worshiping it. That by removing its status and even forcing someone to remove its status, you fundamentally remove the temptation to actually worship that item.
But I have a question about, so at this point.
Okay, can I?
Hold on, there's just one more there's one more point I want to mention, then we can do a broad discussion on that. And then the thirdly is that if you do not say that coercion is not a deal breaker, then any idolater can say, well, the person who desanctified it was probably forced, which means it wasn't desanctified, which means you are still holding on to an idolatrous item, right? If there is the suspicion that the desanctification came only by compulsion, and if compulsion were prohibited in this case, then that means no desanctification would ever be considered as viable or as valid by anyone else. Everyone would assume that it would only have been done by compulsion, and therefore every desanctification would be suspect. All right, questions and comments?
I had a question about, it says that he was slapped, that he slapped him across the face. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a superficial kind of thing. And I revoked it and the status. What I'm thinking is that for a Gentile to be put in a position where he has to, live on in his own area, the fact that the rabbi slapped him didn't really hit him or beat him, or, unless the word is wrong. It's a minor thing to kind of cover the Gentile. Sorry, didn't hear you.
I said no. The word "slapped" is a reasonable translation.
I was going to say, Rabbi, okay, first of all, okay, so this was found property, correct?
Correct.
So he found the ring, but now he can melt it down and use the gold for tzedakah or for his own whatever. If he couldn't get this revoked, must it be buried?
Well, actually, it would need to be destroyed. The burial is a little bit of an unusual form. Generally speaking, it would be either thrown into the Dead Sea or simply crushed and powdered and scattered into the sea or the river or some other form of obliterating it.
So in some ways, this revoking the idolatry status is affirming the status of the property, that this is not an idol, this is, a lump of gold.
Exactly. It's just a ring. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to continue on this topic of the revocation and all of that. But we're going to continue with a little bit more, commentary to see if that helps either clear it up or, make us even less pleased. It is also possible, meaning where these idols came from, that the sons of Jacob had simply not been careful to differentiate between different kinds of loot. When they examined it at home, it was already too late to do anything about neutralizing these objects and making them usable for a Jew. Some of these idols may have been hidden within other larger vessels, which the sons of Jacob had captured. If they had a jug that had an idol inside of it, they grabbed the jug not knowing the contents. Another possibility is that the gods which have been neutralized in time somehow became mixed with others which had not, meaning they had gotten some of them to be nullified, but others had not been. But then they became mixed, and now there was no one left to nullify. So you have to throw out all of it because it has become a contaminated mess. Questions? Okay, let's go ahead then and we'll get the next part from Or HaChaim, who had a lot to say on this. Jacob instructed the members of his household to purify themselves because contact with idols defiles a person. Maimonides writes in his Hilchot Avot HaTumah, right, his section of the Mishnah Torah that deals with the primary sources of ritual impurity, chapter 6, that any primary source of serious impurity, which confers impurity through touch or through carrying it, not only confers impurity on any person who touches the same thing, but also on anyone touching or carrying objects that have been in touch with the person who is a primary source, right? So there is a level of once removed that happens with things that are primary sources of ritual impurity that allows their transmission to be passed down one additional level. Accordingly, Jacob was quite right when he instructed his people to purify themselves and their clothing, even if not they personally, but only their clothing had been in contact with the idolatrous trinket. Jacob was always also very precise in referring to your garments. He meant that the garment worn by the people of Shechem at the time they were slain had to be purified also. Right? So what he's trying to say here is that the purification doesn't imply that the people were worshiping the idols, but it does remind us that an idol confers impurity, and therefore simply having come in contact with them, even if they're also going to get rid of them, means that purification of themselves and the clothes, and especially the clothes of those that were the victims in Shem, those that were killed, all have to go through a purification process as well.
Right. If we take it as given that Jacob followed all of Torah, and that he's creating here a kingdom of priests, they've had a lot of contact, not just with idols, dead people, and so there is that whole need for purification.
Absolutely, right. They're coming out of a rather difficult episode, to say the least, from the chapter before this, and this purification is critical for them being able to move forward without the continued transmission of that ritual impurity.
It also implies that it's not beneficial to loot people afterwards. I mean, after violence, you can't just take everything or their clothes or it sets a limit, I think, on looting someone you've conquered or overcome or massacred. You can't profit from it.
Well, you can, but there are very strict rules, and it's a lot of rigmarole that you have to deal with. In fact, sometimes people are unaware, but the laws of kashrut, of how you make a pot kosher if it's become contaminated or if you want to change it to another type, from meat to dairy or dairy to meat, or if you're preparing to use it for Pesach, for Passover, that the laws of how we deal with those different materials and make them kosher again or transfer their kashrut status is derived from the laws of how we deal with the loot from when we are fighting the people during the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers. So the whole concept of making something kosher is derived from the material kosher. It is derived from the issues of looting, that it should not be a free-for-all. There is a step in between what you take and how you then use or throw it away. That the looting may happen, but that doesn't mean everything you take from those that you have attacked, even in a justified and appropriate battle, is something you get to keep. That there are things that can be cleansed and then used, and other things which are simply meant to be destroyed and no longer held on to after that fact. But that is hard to get our heads around. The issue is, that we often don't know why we're taking things and what's going on, which is why Radak tries to give us a broader statement of what's happening here than a question of whether it was or wasn't desanctified by the other people in the area. Even though Yaakov, Jacob's sons, had not taken these items in order to worship them, but in order to melt them down and put them to other uses, that is to use the melted down gold and silver, Yaakov did not want his children or household to benefit from anything which had once served idolatrous purposes, although it was no longer recognizable as something that had once served such a purpose. So what Radak is trying to argue here is that Jacob really was taking a higher road when dealing with these items, that even if it was possible to have desanctified them, even if it was possible to melt them down and use them, he did not want his children to become habituated or known for benefiting from these idolatrous items that had that status at one point in their existence. That it was better for them to be abandoned and thrown away rather than hold on to them. This also explains why they weren't destroyed in the classical obliterate or throw into the Dead Sea method, because they weren't technically idols anymore. They were simply the wealth of idols, and therefore it was better to simply bury them rather than actually destroy them, since they weren't idols technically at that point, according to Radak and others' interpretation. But his idea here of distancing ourselves from even the hint that we are benefiting from this idolatrous material is very reminiscent of the behavior of his grandfather Abraham, who returned after recapturing Lot and the loot that had been taken from Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain. And when he talks to the king of Sodom, he says, I don't want to be thought of as somebody who's benefited one bootstrap from you. And he doesn't even want the hint that anything that is part of his blessing came through that contaminated source, like the people of Sodom. And so too, Jacob seems here, according to Radak, to be imitating that same idea, that he doesn't even want there to be a suspicion that this item was connected to idolatry and that his family has now somehow profited from that. Which will lead us to our final concept that I want to end with. This is taken from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, modern scholar, from his book, God in Search of Man, which I highly recommend. It's not an easy read, but it's very worthwhile. And you can also find this in our Sidur Lev Shalem as one of the marginal notes during the recitation of the Shema. And he asked rhetorically, what is an idol? It is a thing, a force, a person, a group, an institution, or an ideal regarded as supreme. God alone is supreme. And this idea is so powerful because in the modern world, we don't often bump up against actual idols and statues. Most of us are not going to find a statue of Zeus. Most of us are not going to be given a gift of a statue of Athena. However, we do often come across people that have made idols, made certain aspects of this world as supreme and treated as above all else. And of course, if it's above all else, then my implication, it's also treating it as though it were above God. And when we deal with that, we have to make sure that we keep as far from it as we would from a physical idol. That for those that are engaged in worshiping a person or worshiping a group or an institution, even ones that are worthwhile and noble, we have to still remind ourselves that the group, the institution, the person is not truly what is at the top of everything. That's God. And everything in the world is still subject to that reflection of God. And if we forget that God is above it, then we are guilty of idolatry. And if we think there is a hint that we are going too far in our idolization of person, group, institution, or even ideals, then we have to make sure we bury it far from us and distance ourselves from that with all of our energy and effort. Any additional thoughts, comments, questions that we can discuss for our last couple minutes? Oh,
I have an unrelated question.
okay. Yeah.
When I put up my mezuzah, this is the door. Does it go at this angle or this angle? This, like it's leaning in towards the door.
Right. So the mezuzah for your doorways should be on the right-hand door frame, as though you were walking into the house.
Right.
And it should lean so that the top of the mezuzah leans into the house.
Right. Okay. Got it.
And that's for the other doorways inside of a house as well. Some also do need a mezuzah too, like a bedroom or such. It should lean into the room as though you had been flowing in a path from the outer door into that space. So sometimes you have to figure out, your fire escape route. What would be my closest door to the outside world? And then you angle the mezuzahs inward from that outer door into the innermost spaces of your house.
Right.
If you need help with that, let me know, and I'll be happy to examine if you have a picture or something. It's a lot easier than the hand gestures on Zoom are sometimes inexact.
I'll check when at Shabbat to make sure I did it the right way.
Got it.
It's on the door of the synagogue.
Ah. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all very much. A reminder that we have Mishnah class again tonight. That's at 7 p.m. And of course, Pathway to Judaism will be tomorrow at 6 p.m. And tomorrow we will be discussing Hanukkah, both the mitzvot as well as the story behind it. So for those of you that are interested, I hope to see you there through Zoom or YouTube. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.